Back off. Her voice came out flat and even, which surprised her more than it surprised the men who turned to look. Vera Duchamp was 26 years old, standing alone in the gravel lot of the Halfway Point truck stop, north of Kelloch, Ontario, at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in early October. She had grease under her fingernails and an empty coffee cup on the passenger seat of her pickup, and absolutely no plan beyond the words she'd just said. There were four of them, big men or big enough, work jackets, steel-toed boots, the kind of posture that said no one had ever made them stop before. They were standing in a loose circle around an older man on the ground, a biker, silver-haired leather vest worn soft from years of road. His motorcycle was on its side 6 meters away. The engine was still ticking in the cold air. One of the four had his boot resting very deliberately near the man's right hand. Vera had counted to 5 before she moved, the way her father used to count when he was deciding whether to take a difficult job. 1, the man on the ground tried to push himself upright. 2, the truck stop clerk was watching from behind the glass. 3, a transport driver near the fuel pumps looked away. 4, Vera thought about her father, what he would have done. 5, she reached into the bed of her truck, pulled out a breaker bar, and walked toward them. Back off, she said again, right now. The man nearest her had a jaw like a cinder block and small, assessing eyes. He took a long moment to process what he was seeing. Young woman, dark hair loose from its braid, oil-stained coveralls, a piece of steel in her right hand, and then he smiled. You sure about that, sweetheart? I'm not your sweetheart, Vera said. And there are cameras on every pump here. I counted 3 of them. That landed, she saw his eyes move just a flicker toward the pump canopy. Walk away, she said, or we all find out together what happens next. A voice behind her said, I already called 911. It was the transport driver. He'd turned back around. He was on his phone and the screen was lit. The 4 men exchanged something, a look, a calculation. Then the one with the cinder block jaw said, let's go, in a tone that was very careful to sound like his own idea. They left. 2 trucks, no hurry. Vera stood where she was until the taillights were gone around the bend, and then she let the breath out of her. Her hands were shaking badly enough that the breaker bar rattled when she set it on the ground. She crouched next to the man. Let me have a look, she said. I'm fine. Your ribs say otherwise. She could tell by the way he was holding himself, that specific controlled stillness of someone managing pain, breath by breath. And you've got a cut above your eye that's going to keep going if we don't clean it. He studied her for a moment. His eyes were sharp and gray and didn't look frightened, which told her something. You always walk toward trouble like that? Only when it's already happening, she said. His name was August Morrow. He told her when she helped him to his feet, told her the full name, not the one the men he rode with used, which was Gravel, a name he'd been carrying for 30 years and didn't bother explaining. He let her ride his motorcycle and push it to the edge of the lot, and when she told him the engine had taken on fluid where it shouldn't, he didn't argue. He accepted a ride to the urgent care clinic in Kelloch without making it a production, and he didn't say much for the first several minutes, which she respected. What kind of work? He asked finally, looking at her hands on the wheel. Mechanic. My dad's garage, north end of town, Duchamp's. You run it? 2 years now. He was quiet again. Then how's it going? She kept her eyes on the road. It's going. He didn't press. Men who'd seen enough of the world knew when an answer was actually a door held shut. The clinic was quiet. She sat in the waiting room while they cleaned the cut above his eye and taped his ribs. And she told herself she'd leave after 10 minutes, and then 20, and then she was still there when he came back out, moving with the careful economy of someone redistributing weight around pain they decided to live with. You didn't have to stay, he said. I know. He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had been reading people for a long time and was accurate about it. What do you owe on the garage? The question hit her sideways. I don't know you well enough for that. You walked into a situation tonight that wasn't yours, he said. That's not nothing. People don't do that without something behind it. She picked up her jacket. Come by tomorrow if you want to look at the bike. I'll do that, he said, and a few other things. He arrived at 8 the next morning with 2 other men. Len Sturdy was quiet and gray-bearded with the patient eyes of a man who had been fixing things his whole life. The other one, younger, went by Birch. He had a watchfulness that was easy to mistake for distance, the watchfulness of someone who was always listening more carefully than he appeared to be. Their vests had a patch Vera recognized, Iron Wolves MC. She'd grown up around motorcycle clubs. Her father had worked on bikes for 2 independent clubs in the county and had always been matter-of-fact about it. But her stomach did something complicated as they parked. They were polite. They looked around the garage with the practiced attention of people who understood machinery and knew what a maintained shop looked like versus a struggling one. Gravel introduced everyone without ceremony and walked his bike into the bay and let her work. She found the fluid intrusion in the primary seal, plus a valve clearance that was 3 services overdue. She talked through each thing as she found it, not performing, just working, and was aware in the background of her focus that all 3 men were watching her in the way people watch someone genuinely good at something. When she finished and gave Gravel the number, he didn't flinch. He said, "When can you have it done?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "Good." He paused. "Can I see the business side? The books, the correspondence, anything outstanding?" Vera set down her ratchet. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what you're working with." "I don't need charity." "I didn't offer any," he said. "I asked to see the books." She looked at him, then at Len, then at Birch. None of them were performing patience. They were just present, the way men were when they decided something was worth waiting on. She went and got the files. It took Gravel 20 minutes to go through 2 years of paperwork that had kept her awake more nights than she could count. He read quietly, thoroughly, without unnecessary expression. Len leaned in once to point at something. Birch had pulled up a stool and was reading over Gravel's shoulder. When Gravel looked up, his face had changed. Something in it had gone quiet and focused in a way it hadn't been before. "Who is Ridgeline Capital Group?" he asked. The name landed in Vera's chest like something dropped from a height. "They want to buy this property," she said carefully. "They've contacted me 3 times in 8 months, each offer higher than the last." Len said, "We've seen this pattern before. Not these people specifically, this type. They identify a property they want, usually because there's something underneath the acquisition that makes it worth more than it looks. A development corridor, a proximity to something that's about to go in nearby." He paused. "Then they decide whether it's cheaper to buy clean or to make buying easier first." Vera felt the hairs on her arms stand up. Make buying easier. Accounts that disappear. Rumors that start from nowhere. Inspections that get triggered from complaints no one can trace. Financing that gets difficult for no reason you can put your finger on. Len said it levelly, without drama. "It's not dramatic, it's just friction. Enough friction over enough time, and a business that was perfectly solid 3 years ago starts to look like it's failing. And the owner, who's been carrying all of it alone, looks at the offer and thinks maybe it's time." The garage was very quiet. "My father lost 3 accounts in his last year," Vera said. Her voice had gone somewhere strange. Level but strange, 3 accounts that had been with him for years. He thought he'd done something wrong. He spent the last year of his life thinking he'd somehow let his own business slide. She looked at the floor, then back up. "He was 57. Is that what happened? Was that them?" "I don't know yet," Gravel said, "but I intend to find out." The mechanic who had spent her whole life fixing broken things had just discovered that the most important broken thing in her world hadn't broken by accident. She didn't cry. She'd gotten good at not crying after her father died. Too many decisions, too many creditors, too many contractors who would read tears as weakness. She'd learned to let the waves move through her and keep her feet. But this one was different. Because this wasn't grief. Grief she understood. Grief was clean in its terrible way. This was finding out that the version of her father she'd been carrying for 2 years, the man who had somehow missed a step and let his life's work slide, was a story someone else had written and placed inside her like a stone. She made coffee. She made enough for 4. Nobody said anything for a while. She spent the rest of that day pulling files. There was more than she'd realized she had. The mechanic's instinct to document, to keep receipts, to note when something seemed off, even if she couldn't name it. The letters from Ridgeline. A notice from the county about a drainage inspection that had never gone anywhere. 3 emails from former clients with the same vague language about consolidating services. A voicemail from someone who'd identified himself as a regional planning assistant, asking about her property line on the north side. She spread it all across the workbench. Gravel and Birch went through it piece by piece. "This one," Birch said, pointing to the planning call she'd written down at the time. "Did you ever hear from them again?" "No, I thought it was routine." "It was reconnaissance." He photographed the page. Then Vera went to get her father's files. 4 boxes from the storage room she hadn't opened in over a year because the handwriting had been too much to face. She set them on the floor and looked at them. "Take your time," Gravel said. She opened the first box. Her father's handwriting looked back at her. Neat, deliberate, the writing of a man who had been taught that written things mattered. Notes going back years. Customer records, yes, but also observations. A man who had driven slowly past the garage twice in 1 week and stopped to photograph it both times. An entry about a town council decision affecting his property taxes. A note about another business owner 2 towns south who'd mentioned a development company sniffing around. And then near the bottom of the second box, in a folder dated 20 months before he died, a letter from a man named Marcus Holroyd of Ridgeline Capital Group. The offer in the letter was lower than any of the 3 she'd received. Her father's handwritten draft reply was paperclipped to the back. 3 sentences. "Mr. Holroyd, thank you for your interest in Duchamp's garage. This is not something I have any interest in selling. And below the draft, in smaller writing, almost as if he were talking to himself, find out who is behind this man. Vera sat on the concrete floor with her father's words in her hands. The garage hummed around her. The refrigerator she kept for clients. The fluorescent light that had been buzzing slightly for 3 weeks. The sound of a truck downshifting on the highway outside. Her father had known. He had been trying to find the center of it, and then he had died before he could. She looked up at Gravel. He had crossed the bay and crouched down to read the letter over her shoulder. When he stood back up, something had settled in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something old and pointed inward. Birch, he said. Yeah, Birch said. He'd already seen it from where he was standing. We're going to need more people. She had not expected any of this. 48 hours ago, she had been figuring out how to cover the compressor repair and whether the winter was going to finish what was left of her clientele. Now she was sitting in her father's garage at 9 in the evening, with 3 members of the Iron Wolves going through her father's files, beginning to understand that the last 2 years of her life, every lost account, every narrowing month, every morning she'd stood in this bay wondering what she was doing wrong, had never been about her failure at all. Birch had made calls while she and Gravel worked. He came back after an hour. 3 other business owners in the county have been touched by Ridgeline, or something connected to them in the last 4 years. 1 sold, 2 didn't, but they're on the edge. How do you know this? Vera asked. Because we pay attention, Birch said, and because people talk to us, not because they trust institutions, but because they trust the men standing in front of them. She thought about that. She thought about the 4 men at the truck stop who had assumed no one would stop them, about the transport driver who had looked away, and then when she moved first, turned back. No one moves first. That was the thing. Everyone waits for someone else to go. She had moved first by reflex, by the voice in her head that had always sounded like her father's. Broken things don't fix themselves, Vera. Someone always has to start. She called the first name on Birch's list at 7:15 the following morning, sitting in her truck in the lot before opening. Carl Brandt had owned an auto parts and supply shop on Highway 11 for 28 years. Past tense, he'd sold 10 months ago to a holding company that Birch had already traced back to Ridgeline through 2 subsidiary layers. When Vera explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a long silence. Your father, Carl said. Jim Duchamp. He came to see me about 2 months before he passed. Vera went very still. Sat at my counter for 2 hours with a recorder he asked permission to use. He was thorough. He was angry. Kept it controlled, but you could see it. A pause. He had a theory about a strip of Highway 11 where 6 or 7 properties would form a continuous corridor if someone connected the dots on a map. Something very valuable to a large developer. He talked about this at a county small business meeting too, Carl continued. Before he came to see me, there were 40, maybe 50 people in that room. He stood up and laid it out clearly. Specific properties, specific pattern. The pause this time was heavier. 3 months later, I heard he'd died, and 2 months after that, my first dealership account called to cancel. She met Carl at a diner on the county road and listened for an hour. He was a precise man, careful in his memory, and by the end of it, she understood that what had been done to him had been done with surgical exactness. Elsa Winther, who had run a roadside diner for 22 years and lost her 2 largest catering contracts inside of 6 weeks, was sharp and furious in the contained way of a woman who had decided that anger needed to be useful or it would eat her. She had been keeping a folder for 3 years. She handed it to Vera across her kitchen table without being asked. Your father told me to hold on, Elsa said. He said he was getting close to something, and when he had it solid, things were going to change. Her jaw tightened. Then he died. I thought maybe he'd just been trying to be kind. He wasn't being kind, Vera said. He had more than I knew. The last name before the one who'd already sold was Pete Nakamura, retired, who had owned an equipment rental shop on the eastern end of the corridor for 19 years. Pete was 67 with the unhurried dignity of a man who had built something real and wasn't going to act like he hadn't, regardless of what had happened to it. When Vera walked into his workshop, he looked at her for a long moment. Jim Duchamp's daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. I wondered when someone would come. He visited you, Vera said. 2 months before he died. He had a recorder and a list of questions, and he spent 3 hours going through what had happened to my business. He was thorough, he was kind, and he was genuinely angry, which he kept controlled, but which I could see. A pause. He left something with me, a sealed envelope. He said if anyone came asking the right questions, I should give it to them. He let that sit for a moment. You're asking them. Pete went into the back. He was gone 4 minutes. He came back with a standard white envelope, her father's name written across the front in his own hand. Vera's fingers were steady because she made them steady. She sat in her truck in Pete's parking lot and opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet, both sides covered in her father's neat, angular writing. The first side was a timeline, dates and events for each of the Highway 11 businesses, drawn from his conversations with Carl, Elsa, Pete, and two others whose names appeared at the bottom. Side by side, the pattern was undeniable. Each business had experienced a cluster of disruptions beginning at staggered intervals, as though each one had been started on a schedule, each one calibrated to a different threshold. The second side had four names. The first was Marcus Holroyd, Ridgeline Capital Group. The second was a company called Norwood Planning Associates. Her father had written next to it, Front Company, connects to Holroyd. The third was Ray Whitmore, County Economic Development Office. Her father had written, ran the corridor meetings, who told Holroyd about AW11. The fourth name stopped her cold. Douglas Fenn. She read it twice to make sure she was reading it right. Douglas Fenn had been her family's accountant for 18 years. He had sat in the front row at her father's funeral with his wife. He had held Vera's hand and said, "Your father was one of the finest men I have ever known." According to the bottom of the page, he was currently on the board of Norwood Planning Associates. She called Gravel from Pete's parking lot. She told him about the envelope, about the timeline, about the four names, about Douglas Fenn. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Don't go near Fenn," he said. "Don't call him. Don't change anything about how you normally deal with him. Can you do that?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to say what she actually wanted to do was walk into Fenn's office and set the letter on his desk and watch his face. She breathed through it. Yes, I can do that. Because if Fenn knew they had this, the evidence became harder to use. The lawyer Gravel brought in drove up from Sudbury the next afternoon in a car that had seen better days. Her name was Miriam Osei, and she had the calm of someone who had worked in difficult rooms before and was not impressed by difficulty. She listened to everything for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she set her pen down. "You have enough for a civil case against Ridgeline and Norwood, and potentially against Fenn's financial structure," she said. "What you don't have yet is anything that triggers a provincial criminal investigation. For that, you need someone inside the structure to cooperate." She looked at Vera steadily. "Most immediate threat is your business loan. If Fenn flags it and calls the note early, you're in a very difficult position regardless of what else we're building." "He controls my debt," Vera said. "He always has," Miriam said. "And he knows exactly how much pressure you can absorb before the math stops working in your favor. That's why the timeline on your garage has been slower than the others. He's been calibrating." The precision of it hit Vera differently than the general outrage had. Every lost account, every inspection notice, every tightening month, measured against numbers Douglas Fenn had on his desk. The man who had taught her how to read a profit and loss statement when she was 19. The man who had said at the funeral, "Your father talked about you constantly, you know. He said you were going to surpass him one day." She stood up. She walked the length of the bay and came back. "What do we do first?" she said. They filed a motion on the loan note. Predatory lending practices based on conflict of interest. It would tie up any action on the note while it was pending. It would also tell Fenn they knew. "We're past the point where concealment helps us," Gravel said. "If he knows, he has two choices. Go quiet and let the legal process run, or do something that makes him look worse." They went to see Ray Whitmore the following morning. His office was on the second floor of the county administration building, and his assistant looked at Gravel's vest and then at Vera, and picked up the phone very quickly. They were shown in within 2 minutes. Whitmore was 53, slight with the presentation of a man whose career had been built in rooms where image mattered. He stood when they entered and smiled with the specific smile of someone deploying a learned behavior while their brain was doing something else entirely. "Monsieur Duchamp," he said, "I knew your father." "I know," Vera said. "That's why I'm here." She laid it out plainly, not as an accusation but as information. The timeline, the four names, what the corridor meetings had been used for, what had happened in the months after her father had stood in a room with 49 other people and described a pattern clearly enough that someone had decided he was a problem. Whitmore's hands changed on his desk, unfolded, refolded tighter. "I would need to speak to my solicitor before." "You can do that," Vera said, "but I want you to understand something first." She leaned forward slightly. "My father came into this building. He sat in meetings in this building. He talked about what was happening to him and to his neighbors. And someone in this building heard him and passed that information to the people doing it to him." She kept her voice level. She had spent the morning making sure it would. 2 months after that last meeting, my father had a heart attack at 57. And the people who were dismantling everything he'd built knew exactly when his funeral would be a good time to check on the status of their investment. The professional expression left Whitmore's face entirely. What replaced it was smaller and more real. A man standing in a room that had just become a great deal smaller. "I didn't know anyone would get hurt," he said quietly, almost to the desk. "What did you know?" Gravel asked. What followed took 40 minutes. Whitmore had been approached 3 years earlier by an attorney connected to Norwood Planning Associates. He had provided information about which properties fell within the development footprint, which business owners were financially stressed, which had county relationships that could be leveraged. He had passed along a summary of everything Jim Duchamp has at the corridor meeting, the specific properties named, his level of research, how far along his investigation appeared to be. And he had attended a dinner 14 months ago where Holroyd and Fenn had discussed the Duchamp garage directly in front of him. What was said? Vera asked. Whitmore pressed his lips together then. Holroyd said the garage was the linchpin. Without it, the eastern section of the development couldn't connect to the western section. The whole project lost significant value. A pause. Fenn said you were holding together better than your father had, that the financial pressure was taking longer than projected. He stopped. He said what else? Gravel asked. He said they might need to apply more direct pressure, that he had a contact who handled that type of approach. Whitmore exhaled. 3 weeks later, I heard through Norwood's attorney that there had been some incidents at your property. Small things, easy to call accidents. Vera thought about the scratched bay door she'd written off as teenagers. The supply delivery with a broken axle she'd blamed on the courier. Small things, easy to call accidents. She nodded once. Miriam moved them forward. Whitmore agreed in the end to put everything on paper. What he gave them in 4 hours of recorded testimony was enough to file a package with the Provincial Attorney General's office that Miriam described, without exaggeration, as comprehensive. They worked until 11 that night making copies. Physical copies, photograph copies, copies sent to 3 separate addresses. Miriam went through every page with a precision Vera found genuinely comforting. Not because precision fixed what was broken, but because it meant someone was taking what she had and treating it like it mattered. Late in the evening, when Miriam had stepped outside to make a call, Vera found herself alone at the workbench with her father's handwritten document in front of her. She had read it enough times to have most of it memorized. But she kept coming back to the line he'd written at the bottom of the page, below the 4 names, almost to himself. Find out who is behind this man. He had been close. He'd visited Carl and Elsa and Pete. He'd been putting the picture together with his recorder and his careful questions, and then his heart had stopped on a Wednesday morning in February, and the picture had stayed unfinished. Until now. Marcus Holroyd came to the garage 6 days later. It was 7 in the evening, 40 minutes after she'd officially closed. She heard the car, expensive, quiet engine, someone who had stopped noticing the cost, and then footsteps that were deliberate without being rushed. She was at the workbench when he knocked. He was 61, well-dressed, with the easy posture of a man who had spent his career in the room with the advantage. He looked around the garage with professional neutrality. Mrs. Duchamp, he said, I apologize for the hour. I was hoping to have a direct conversation. I know who you are, she said. Come in. Something moved in his eyes at the fact that she wasn't surprised. He absorbed it smoothly. I understand there's been some recent legal activity related to your business note, he said, and some conversations with the county about our development project. I'd like to give you a more complete picture, because I think some of what you've been told may be one-sided. Tell me your version, she said, and I'll tell you where it matches what I know. He recalibrated. He'd come expecting exhaustion and desperation and had found something else. The development project, he explained, was legitimate, good for the county, responsible planning, significant economic benefit. But it did require a continuous corridor, and her garage was at the geographic center of that corridor. I know, she said. He paused. Then you understand why we've been systematically pressuring businesses along Highway 11 to make them easier to acquire, she said. Yes, I understand that very well. The warmth behind his expression evaporated. That's a serious allegation. It's a documented fact, she said. I have the timeline my father built before he died. I have testimony from 4 business owners who went through the same process. I have a county official who has given a formal recorded statement describing his role in passing information to your organization. She held his gaze. And I have a record of a dinner 14 months ago where you and Douglas Fenn discussed applying more direct pressure to this property, because I wasn't responding to the financial approach the way you'd hoped. Holroyd went very still. Ray Whitmore, he said quietly. Yes. He breathed once through his nose. The calculation behind his eyes shifted character. It was no longer the calculation of someone managing a situation. It was the calculation of someone trying to find the least bad option that was actually available to them. I came to make you a real offer, he said finally. Fair market value for this property, plus a settlement that addresses any concerns about how things were handled. He named a figure. It was a real number. A number that would have solved every problem she had and several she hadn't encountered yet. 6 months ago, it would have felt like being saved. She thought about her father's draft reply, paperclipped to the back of Holroyd's first letter, 3 sentences. And below them in smaller writing, find out who is behind this man. No, she said. He blinked. This garage is not for sale, she said. This conversation is over. He stood there for one more moment, working through his remaining options and finding them smaller than he'd expected when he'd walked in. You should think carefully about what you're doing, he said. It was the closest he'd come to the direct pressure Whitmore had described. Not quite a threat, the shape of one. The bay door behind him opened. Gravel walked in, Len behind him, Birch behind Len. They didn't say anything. They just stood there. Holroyd turned and looked at them, turned back to Vera. Good night, Mr. Holroyd, she said. He left. Nobody spoke for 10 seconds after his car pulled out of the lot. Then Birch held up the small recorder from his jacket pocket. Every word. Miriam stepped out from behind the truck she'd been standing behind for the entire conversation. Her pen was already moving. The threat at the end, combined with Whitmore's testimony about direct pressure being discussed at that dinner, that's not ambiguous. Combined with everything else we file tomorrow morning. Douglas Fenn cooperated 17 days later, after the Banking Regulatory Board opened a review his attorneys hadn't managed to get ahead of. His cooperation agreement came through 2 weeks after that. He named every transaction, every conversation, every instance where he had used knowledge of his client's finances to calibrate the pressure Ridgeline applied. Jim Duchamp was named specifically. Fenn had provided Holroyd with a precise assessment of what the garage could absorb, what it would take, month by month, to bring Vera to the table without her understanding why she'd arrived there. The man who had taught her how to read her own books. The man who had been at the funeral. Vera was at the workbench when Gravel told her. She set down the socket wrench she was holding and put it down very carefully. She looked at the locked drawer where she'd put her father's document, the timeline, the 4 names, and the line he'd written at the bottom. Find out who was behind this man. She had found out. Her father had started it, visiting Carl and Elsa and Pete, building the picture with his recorder and his careful questions, leaving an envelope with Pete Nakamura for whoever came next, and she had followed the thread he'd left. She called all 4 of them that night, Carl Brandt, Elsa Winther, Pete Nakamura, and Sandra Fong, the bookkeeper 2 towns south who had closed her practice quietly, privately, certain she had simply failed at something she'd spent 16 years building, never knowing why her 2 largest clients had left within the same month, never knowing her name had been on a list. Your father came to see me too, Sandra said when Vera called. He said he was building a picture. He said when he had the center of it, he was going to need people willing to stand up and say what happened to them. A long pause. He was right. He didn't get to finish it, Vera said. No, Sandra said quietly, but you did. The civil settlement came 6 weeks after the AG filing. Holroyd signed an explicit acknowledgement, not in corporate language, not in passive voice, but in plain terms naming the actions taken against each business and the people who had directed them. Compensation for Carl, Pete, and Sandra was placed in escrow. Elsa, who was still open, declined to settle civilly so she could remain an active complainant in the criminal proceedings. She said she wanted it on record. She said she wanted people to know. The criminal investigation moved on its own schedule. Holroyd eventually took a plea, all 3 counts. Fenn faced regulatory consequences that ended his career, and then criminal charges he was still working through when October came around again, and Vera was in the bay on a Tuesday morning with her hands inside an old Silverado that had been waiting 3 weeks, and Gravel walked in and set a coffee on the workbench beside her. Holroyd's plea includes a full dissolution of the Highway 11 development project as currently planned, he said. It went through this morning. She stopped what she was doing. She looked at the walls of the garage, the walls her father had framed himself, one weekend in July with 2 friends and a borrowed nail gun, at the floor he'd poured, at the bay door that still needed painting. She thought about her father driving Highway 11 with his recorder and his careful questions, visiting each of those people one by one, building something he believed in even as the months shortened around him. About Carl Brandt sitting across from her at that diner, relief and anger arriving at the same time on his face. The face of someone who had been isolated with a bad thing for so long that the relief of talking was almost physical. She thought about the 5 seconds in the gravel lot of the halfway point truck stop, and the count she'd done before she moved, and how her father's voice was the thing she'd heard it for. That night, she said, when you were on the ground, were you scared? Gravel considered it the way he considered most things, directly, without softening it. More angry than scared, he said. I've been in worse. A pause. But when you walked toward them, I was scared for you. 3 seconds, maybe. What happened after 3 seconds? You planted your feet, he said, and I stopped being scared. She looked at him. At this man who had kept a promise to her father that her father had never known he was collecting on, who had shown up not because of what Vera had done at that truck stop, but because of what Jim Duchamp had done for him, years ago, in a moment no one had thought to write down. He never called you, she said. When things got bad, he never called. No, Gravel said. He didn't. He didn't like asking for help. I know. She picked up her ratchet. I'm not him, she said. Something in Gravel's face shifted, something that had been carrying weight for a long time, just slightly lighter now. No, he said, you're not. Outside, Highway 11 ran north toward the lake country and south toward the city, the same road it had always been, the same road Jim Duchamp had driven every morning for 31 years. The businesses along it were still there. Carl's new shop on the north end of town, Pete's workshop, Elsa's diner with its open sign turned out against the October morning. Each of them was someone inside who had gone to sleep the night the calls came, knowing something they hadn't known that morning. That what had been done to them had a name. That the people who had done it were being held to account. That they had never been as alone as they'd been made to feel. They just needed someone to step forward first. Duchamp's garage on Highway 11 in Kelloch, Ontario was not for sale. It had never been for sale. And now everyone who had decided otherwise understood exactly what it had cost them to find that out.